Okay, good evening, everybody. It's Wednesday night. So tonight, last time we learned the laws of chinuch, the halacha of chinuch. Today we're going to learn the laws of what's called Chabad Ava'im, honoring one's father and mother. And by the way, just for people that at the present don't have parents, nevertheless, the laws, as we will learn, the laws of honoring your father and mother apply not only when they're alive, but even after they pass away. These laws are really applicable to all people. Every person obviously has a father and a mother, except Adam, Rishon, and Chava, but everybody else has a father and mother. So all the dinim of Chabad Ava'im, honoring your father and mother, apply. Now it says like this: you have to be extremely careful with the honor of your father and mother, and not only the honor. There's two mitzvahs. It says Kabet es avicha v'esimecha, honor your father and mother. And it says, Ish imay va'aviv tiro. There's a mitzvah that each man should fear his father and mother. Now, what's interesting, by honoring the parents, by tapping, it says first avicha and then imecha. First your father and then your mother. By fear, it says, Ish imay va'aviv tiro. First the mother, then the father. So Rashi comments in the Gemara, why by honoring does it say first the father, then the mother? And by fear, it says first the mother, then the father. The answer like this: the nature of a child is to honor the mother more than the father. The children are more fearful of the father. The mother gives them food, the mother takes care of them, the mother is more open, loving to them. So the bottom line is that the children honor the mother by nature more than the father. So therefore, the Torah says by kabed asavicha, even though normally you would honor your mother more, but the Torah says no, avicha v'simach. Don't forget about your father. By fear, by nature, children fear a father more than the mother. So therefore, the pasuk says ish imay va'avtiro. You have to fear even the mother. But it's a very important mitzvah because the Gemara says that we liken fearing parents to fearing Hashem. Honoring Hashem, it says, Kabed Hashem Mahincha, honor Hashem with your money. Just like there's a mitzvah to honor your parents, honor Hashem, there's a mitzvah to honor your parents. And therefore, the Gemara says that there's three partners in the birth of a person: father and mother, right? They give the body, and Hashem gives them the neshama. So therefore, each one of these three partners, father, mother, Hashem, need to be honored and to be feared. Now, according to halacha, and by the way, the Gemara says, when a child honors his father and mother, Hashem says, I consider it as if I lived amongst you and you honor me. So Chabad Ava'im is a very, very difficult mitzvah. The Gemara in Kedusha, when it speaks about this mitzvah of Chabad Ava'im, the Gemara says it was a great rabbi that did a tremendous amount of honoring the mother, and the mother it was in the Gemara. And he said, I did the mitzvah. They said you didn't even come to a small percentage of the way you need to honor your father and mother. There's a very strange statement in the Gemara, but when you analyze it, you see the extent of the mitzvah of honoring your father and mother. One of the great sages of the Gemara, his name was Rabbi Yosef. This Rabbi Yosef, the Gemara says, was born a double orphan. His father died before he was born. His mother died when he was born. So Rabbi Yosef was raised without a father and without a mother. And Rabbi Yosef in the Gemara says, and people mistake this Gemara, but you have to understand what he's saying over here. Rabbi Yosef says, fortunate is a person who does not have a father and mother. Why? He says, and let's understand what he's saying. He said, because there's no way in the world, if you have parents, that you can honor them the way the Torah demands that you should honor them. So if you don't have parents, you're not obligated that much in the mitzvah, so to speak. So a person to be doing Chabad Ava'im properly, the way the Torah demands from it, it would be a very, very difficult thing to do. You didn't mean, God forbid, that you're lucky if you have father and mother. Okay. So now the din is like this. And many people, especially in America, are unaware of this din. You're not allowed to call your parents by their first name. It's forbidden. Halachically forbidden to call your father and mother by their first name. So they asked the question in the Gemara. They have many times an expression. Somebody said, Abba Chalafta, my father Chalafta. Chalafta was his father's name. But he said Abba Chalafta. So the Chacham and the sages tell us over there he was allowed because he gave a title to his name. He didn't call him Chalafta. He called Abba Chalafta. And because he said my father Chalafta, then it's allowed to use the name. But generally speaking, a person is not allowed to call the parents by the first name. Okay? And the same thing with your rebbes and your teachers, you're also not allowed to call them by their first name. Okay. Even when you daven for them, what happens if you make a mishaberach for them, so then you don't give titles for them. By mishaberach for a chayla, you don't give titles. Because by God, there's no titles. By Hashem, everybody's the same. So therefore, when you daven, then you just say the name and the mother's name, but you don't say Rebbe or Avi or whatever it is. No, you said the last question before.
I know. What about step-grandparents or step-parents?
Step-grandparents, you're also not allowed to call by the first name, unless step-parents, if they give you permission, then you could, otherwise not.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, now there's a din like this. You have a din of fear and a din of honoring. So halacha says, what is the mitzvah of fearing parents? Meaning, you're not allowed to stand in a place which is designated for him to stand in. Let's say your parent has a designated place in shul where they stand. This is their place in shul where they stand. You're not allowed to stand in their place. Or you're not allowed to sit. Let's say they have a designated chair at home. It's, where the father sits or the mother sits. A child is not allowed to sit in the parent's seat. If the parents give them permission, they're allowed to. But without that, a child is not allowed to sit in a parent's seat. And you're not allowed to contradict their words. If they say something, you're not allowed to say no. You're not allowed to contradict them. And you're not allowed to say, yeah, my parent is right, like as if you have an opinion of the matter. All these things shows a tremendous awe and respect. See, murder, fear, doesn't mean here you're afraid they're going to beat you up. That's for little kids. But what it means is you have awe and respect for parents. Showing respect means they walk into the room, you stand up. You don't sit in their seat. You don't stand in their place where they normally do. And the Gemara says, to what extent does this go? And the Gemara brings down, when the Gemara speaks in Kedushin, the tractate Kedushin about the mitzvah of kibbud av v'em, the Gemara says we could learn from a non-Jew guy in Ashkelon. Okay? And he said, it was a guy, Dama ben Asina, his name was called. He was the Gemara learns a lot of laws honoring and fearing parents from Dama ben Asina. And he was a guy in Ashkelon, the Gemara says. This Dama ben Asina had Nebuch a mother that wasn't all there. And a mother that wasn't all there. He was sitting once amongst the dignified people in Rome. And his mother, she was crazy. She came in the middle of the meal and she ripped his clothing and she spat in his face and he didn't say a word. And the Gemara learns out a halacha from that. That means that you're not allowed to get angry at them even if they did this terrible thing, that you're amongst the dignitaries of Rome and they do it. Somebody asked the question, if the teacher is younger than you, Are you allowed to call them by their first name? The answer is really no. If they're your teacher, you should not call them by your first name, even if they're younger. Because still, respect of a teacher is not based on years. It's based on the knowledge they teach you. In fact, we'll soon discuss that what happens if a child is a bigger scholar than the parent. Who respects whom? So the Gemara said, the halacha is, by the way, that this child still respects the parent, even though the child could learn better. But the halacha tells a story. There was a Madame Rothenberg. Right here. There was a Madame Rothenberg, one of the people that compiled the thesis that we have today. When he became the Jewish leader, he refused to go see his father. And he told his father, please don't come visit me. Because they didn't know who should get up for whom. And he didn't want that issue. So because of the question halacha, if a father is not as great as the child, the son, who respects whom? And again, the halacha is that the father still respects, the son still respects the thinking. Still respects the son. The son respects the father. There's a story, it's already in Living Torah a while, not long ago, when the Rebbe, who taught him Chumash and Gemara in Russia, he came to see the Rebbe. He walked into the Rebbe's room, the Rebbe stood up for him. And the Rebbe told him to please sit. He said, I'm not sitting, especially not if the Rebbe is not sitting. So they ended up standing, both of them stood, because each one refused, the Rebbe refused to sit in front of his teacher, and the teachers refused to sit in front of the Rebbe. So they both ended up standing. Later on already, it changed a little bit. But you see that there's a tremendous amount of respect. So the question was asked, what happens if your Rebbe is younger than you? So then the truth is, then you still can't call him by your first name. But in America, it's very common that people call their parents by their first name and the in-laws by their first name. It's not really correct according to Shulchan Aruch. According to halacha, you're not allowed to do it. Okay, now, there's another interesting question the Pasuk can bring down. What happens if a parent comes to a child's home for Shabbos, let's say? Now, normally the child is a head of a family. So the child sits at the head of the table. Now, where do they put the father? Does the father sit at the head or does the son sit at the head? So in halacha, it's interesting. In halacha, so we don't do it. But in halacha, it says the son should sit in his regular chair and the father sits by the side. The halacha says, in actuality, that's not what's done. What's done is the father sits at the head of the table and the son sits off by the side. Now, if you have two heads of the table, so one sits on one head, the other one could sit on the other head, and both heads, not the other end, the other head. So there's two heads, and they both sit there. Then the question is, what happens when your father-in-law comes together with your father? So then you have another issue. That's a lot more complicated. But this same thing applies, by the way, to in-laws as far as what? This in-laws you have to respect, not as much as the obligation of respecting your own biological parents, by the way, but you still have a halachic obligation to respect them. Especially when the parent, your biological parent, is alive. Then there's a biblical obligation, let's say stepmother or stepfather. So if somebody's mother, let's say, remarried, as long as the mother's alive, there's a biblical obligation to respect the stepfather. After the mother passes away, it's still an obligation, but not biblical. It's still the proper thing, same thing with the stepfathers. Okay, so you're not allowed to get angry at your parents, you're not allowed to scream at them. It's silence. They do something you don't like, instead of answering back like they do today, what you have to do is be silent, and you're not allowed to answer back. That is the mitzvah of fearing parents. Okay. By the way, there's another interesting halacha. What happens if you disagree? We're talking about great scholars now. What happens if your father rules one way in halacha, and you disagree with him in halacha? So the halacha is in front of his face, you're not allowed to disagree with him. But outside, not when he's in front of you, then you're allowed to disagree with him. And in fact, we find, for anybody that knows halacha, there's what's called the Tur, which is the source of all the Shulchan Aruch. And he was the son of the Rosh, it's called Rabbeinu Asher. And he disagreed with him a lot. And he writes in his Sefer, the Tur, Adeni Avi, my father says this, and I disagree with him. Recently, those that learn Rambam, 3 chapters a day in Hilchos Shchita, the Rambam quoted his father, and the Rambam says, I disagree with him. So how can you disagree with your father? There's a din in Gemara, you're not allowed to contradict his words. So that they answered, that's only in front of him. But if you're not in front of him and learning, you're allowed to argue. And we find in the Gemara also, they bring down many, many cases when children disagreed with their parents. Rav Shimon Gamliel disagreed with Ram Gamliel. I mean, there's many, many times. Yisrei, Moshe Rabbeinu bowed to Yisrei because it was his father-in-law, correct? Yes, he respected his father-in-law tremendous amount. Because Moshe Rabbeinu was a religious Jew. He kept mitzvahs. So he knew there was a halacha to honor your in-laws also. Okay. He quotes the Rambam Shchita about a certain din. The Rambam brings down, my father forbade it and I permit it. So then if it's in halacha, if it's not in his presence, you can do it. But in his presence, by the way, you can't contradict him, even though you disagree with him. You have to do it later on. Okay, now that's the law of fearing parents. What's the law of honoring parents? What's the mitzvah? So it says you have to feed them, give them to drink, you have to give them clothing, you have to take them in and out, you have to do it with a nice face, smiling. And even if you give your father the best food in the world, father must sing it. But you show a nasty face that I don't even want to do that, you're punished for not respecting the parents. Okay? Now, what happens when the example they give is like this? A doctor said for a patient, let's use it, you're not allowed to smoke. It's very dangerous to smoke. And the father smokes. And he calls over his son. He said, give me a cigarette. Now the question is, the father's asking for a cigarette. Doesn't he have a mitzvah kibbud av v'ein? Okay? And not only that, the father says, if you don't give it to me, I'm not going to forgive you. The then is, he's not obligated to listen to it. Some poskim hold, if it's not dangerous, you should listen to the father. But many poskim hold that under any circumstance, if your father is asking you to do something, and the doctor says he shouldn't do it, so it's unhealthy for the father or the parent about the same thing, you don't do it. Okay, now, who pays for this? Okay, so it says, if there's many kids, the kids split it up. Technically, according to many opinions, you have to feed them and clothe them from the parents' money. What happens if the parents don't have money to buy food and everything? So then the obligation is on kids. He says, if there's rich children versus poor children, the rich children should pay for it. Whatever, every case is different. Every case has to be discussed with the Rav to find out exactly what the halacha is in each of those particular cases. Now, here's another classical case of the Gemara, which is, it sounds great, but it's halachically very difficult to understand. The Gemara tells a story, again, in Goran Kedushin, about this Domer ben Nesina, this non-Jew in Ashkelon. The Chachamim needed a certain jewel for the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol. And when they needed something for the Beis HaMikdash, they were willing to pay whatever you asked for it. They never bargained on it. Generally, another thing, the Rebbe quotes many times, the Arizal, printed already from the Arizal, that when it came to a mitzvah, he never bargained. Like he bought a lulav and Esther, the guy said $1,000, he gave him $1,000. He didn't bargain. Otherwise, other things he bargained. But when it came to a mitzvah, the price they asked him to give, that's it. Came to the Beis HaMikdash, whatever they needed. The problem was the key to the vault where this precious stone was under the father's pillow, and the father was sleeping. The father was sleeping. Okay? So now the Chachamim came to him and said, we want to buy the stone from your father. He went to the room, he saw the father was sleeping. He came back, he said, it's not for sale. They offered a bigger price. Still said no. Until finally they left. Because he didn't wake up his father, Hashem rewarded him that the next year a red heifer was born in his flock, and he made back the money plus. Okay, so we see from here a din, the Gemara tells us, that if a parent is sleeping, it's forbidden to wake him up. It's not kibbud avayim. You're not honoring your parents by waking them up. What happens if you know your father would want to be woken up? Like for instance, he fell asleep Shabbos afternoon. It comes time for mincha. You know your father would want to go to shul, but are you allowed to wake him up or not? The halacha is, if you know the father would want you to wake him up, either because of a big profit he'll get from it, or because it's the sake of a mitzvah, he wants to go to shul to daven, or whatever, halacha says you're allowed to wake him up. Based on this, they ask an interesting question. If that's the case, why didn't Daman ben Nesina wake up his father? His father for sure would have wanted to be woken up to make all that money. Why didn't he wake him up? And the answer is, it's a very interesting lesson in education, in raising kids. Halachically, he was allowed to wake him up. Dama ben Nesina was taught by his parents that money is not everything. There's things more important than money. Even though halachically he would be allowed to wake him up. But Dama ben Nesina was taught by his non-Jewish parents, he was also not Jewish, that there's things in life more important than money. Respecting parents is more important than money. So halachically he would be allowed to wake him up. Like we said today, somebody asked me that the other week in shul. The father was sleeping, they were going to mincha. Should they wake up the father? The answer is yes, they should wake him, because they know the father always comes to shul. He wants to go to shul and be up. So then you're allowed to wake him up. Okay. Now, what happens if your mother told you to do something? And then your father comes and he's angry that you did it. And he says, who told you to do that? Then is, if he knows that if he says ma, mommy, or whatever, the father's going to get angry at the mother, he's not allowed to say that his mother told him. Even though now he's going to get yelled at, because now the father's going to yell at the son instead of the mother. So the din is, to clear din in Shulchan Aruch, that the son should take the blame rather than having the father scream at his mother. And that's called respecting the mother. You're respecting the mother in a way that she's not going to get yelled at by the father. There's also a din, and today people are lenient to that because we assume the parents allow it. That you're obligated to stand when your father and mother walk into the room. Now, again, today is many times not done because we assume the parents are fine with it. They don't care if you don't stand up. But what's interesting, in the Sephardic community, it's remarkable to see. Across the board in the Sephardic community, I've noticed with a lot of different Sephardic people, a parent walks into shul, or the child will stand up. Not only that, I've seen that the father will get an aliyah to the Torah, the child will stand for the entire aliyah of the parent. You don't see that by Ashkenazi. The Sephardim, it's interesting, the Sephardic community is very much into respect of Laida much more than the Americans. But it's a din of Shulchan Aruch. You have to stand up for your father and mother. And then there's an argument, what happens if the father is blind? Because that means there are a lot of blind people. So now the question is, the father is blind, father walks into the room, are you obligated to stand up because he doesn't know the difference? The halacha is you have to stand up. Why? It's a law for your respect. It's not for the father. It's for you have an obligation to respect your parent, even if they won't even know about it. But you still have an obligation to respect the parent. Okay? Because like we find the Gemara, Rabbi Yosef was blind, Rabbi Sheshes was blind, and yet the Chacham had a tremendous amount of respect for them, even though they didn't know if the person stood up or not. The Gemara says Rabbi Yosef, who was blind, but he says when he heard his mother's footsteps, he didn't even see her because she was blind. He said, let me stand up for the Shechina, for the divine presence. He would stand up for his mother, and he said, that's standing up for the Shechina. Okay, okay. One more din, we'll start, and then we'll go to Tanya. And that is, we mentioned before at the beginning, not only is there an obligation to honor your parents when they're alive, you have an obligation to honor them after they pass away also. Okay? How do you honor parents after they pass away? So by the way, it says in halacha, the best way of honoring them is to be a good person. Do mitzvahs in their merit. Be a nice person in a way that them looking down from heaven will have happiness, nachas from the child. So what they need to do is, even after the parents pass away, for instance, for the first year that a parent passes away, you say, when you mention their name, you say, Hareini kaparas mishkavim. Meaning, I should be, if any punishment is due them, it should come to me. Hareini kapara, I should be the kapara for the rest of it. That's for the first 12 months, because then they're still being judged. After 12 months, you say, Olav HaSholem, Zechrona Levracha. You say it like that. You don't have to, by the way, if you're speaking about them and you mention the name 10 times, you don't have to say it 10 times. You know what I mean? Once is enough. But people, even after they pass away, and we're going to learn, it's late now, we're going to go to Tanya, but we're going to learn next time that saying Kaddish and all those things are actually part of the mitzvah of Kibbutz Avayim. Saying Kaddish after they pass away, keeping a yard site, learning extra, that's all part of respecting the parents. But that will learn Mitzvah Shem next Wednesday.